Life on the road, especially here in Louisiana, is a symphony of contrasts. By day, the humid heat embraces you like a wet blanket, heavy and oppressive. The strong sun beats down on the asphalt and steam rises in distorted waves, turning the landscape into a shimmering blur. Vast stretches of swamps spread out along the I-10, with their twisted trees and Spanish moss hanging like ghosts from dry branches. The smell of mold and wet earth, mixed with the scent of the swamp and occasionally a distant trace of sulfur, wafts through the cabin's ventilation, a constant reminder of where you are. This sticky humidity, which saturates clothes in the air, makes even breathing seem like an effort, and sweat drips incessantly, no matter how high the air conditioning is. My routine was always the same. Wake up before sunrise, drink bitter, stale gas station coffee, and start the engine of my rig, a freightliner that had seen more of the country than many humans. Each new day meant hundreds of miles ahead, the scenery repeating but never exactly the same. Stops were at roadside gas stations with flickering, faded lights that seemed to harbor more shadows than people. The smell of diesel was a constant perfume, a reminder of my trade. I ate whatever I could find, drank coffee after coffee, and kept going. It was a life of self-imposed solitude. An escape, I would say. My name is Ethan, and the road was my sanctuary, my only companion on the thousands of miles I traveled. The cramped, noisy cabin of my truck was my home, my refuge. There I could be whoever I wanted, or rather, whoever I didn't have to hide. The solitude of the road was a blessing for me. It allowed me to stay away from everything and everyone, especially from myself, and from certain memories I insisted on keeping buried deep under layers and layers of asphalt and forgetfulness. There was a secret, yes, something from the past that haunted me. A particular ghost I tried to silence with the rumble of the engine and the hypnotic monotony of the road. A misguided decision, a moment of weakness that cost someone I loved dearly. Guilt was a heavy burden, but the road gave me the illusion that I could overcome it, that with every mile I was leaving it behind. I had seen everything on the road. Horrible accidents, strange people, terrifying weather phenomena, but nothing, absolutely nothing prepared me for what was to come. On that specific night, the air was heavier than usual, with a silent premonition I couldn't identify. The moonlight barely pierced the dense clouds, and the stars, usually my companions in the immensity of the night, were hidden. The radio just crackled, and the silence in the cabin was almost suffocating. I felt an unease, something telling me not to stop, to speed up and keep going, no matter what. But I ignored it. Truckers are stubborn, and stubbornness, sometimes, is our downfall.
The night, here in Louisiana, has a peculiar way of closing in. It's not like the swift, dry dusk of the desert or the prolonged twilight of the mountains. Here, it creeps in, damp and suffocating, mingling with the vapors rising from the swamps. On that particular night, this sense of dampness and oppression was amplified by a dense fog that began to creep from the bayou, enveloping the road in a ghostly veil. Visibility dropped drastically, reducing the outside world to an indistinct blur of distant lights and shapeless shadows. The air inside my Freightliner's cabin felt colder, despite the sticky heat that persisted in the Louisiana night air. I slowed down, the truck's headlights barely able to penetrate the white wall in front of me. The monotony of the journey was broken by a growing sense of discomfort, a premonition I couldn't ignore. Suddenly, she appeared, a white, spectral figure at the side of the road. At first, I thought it was some kind of optical illusion, a trick of the fog. But as I got closer, the image became clearer, and reality hit me like a punch to the gut. It was a woman. She stood there, alone, in the thick fog, looking fragile, helpless, a pale silhouette against the dark, damp backdrop. Her arms were crossed over her chest, as if she were hugging herself against a cold I couldn't feel. My initial instinct was to speed up. The road is a dangerous place, and experience taught me to be wary of anything that seems out of place. A woman alone, in the middle of nowhere, on a night like this? Something was wrong. But something inside me, perhaps a remnant of chivalry, or more likely the very loneliness I so embraced, made me hesitate. Her image in the fog, so vulnerable, so exposed to the dangers of the night and the road, overcame any apprehension. There was a touch of despair in her posture, a silent plea that pierced my defenses. I hit the brakes, and the truck groaned, the brake lights illuminating her figure for a moment. She didn't move, just stood there, looking at the road, as if she hadn't noticed my approach. I rolled down the passenger window, feeling the cold, damp air invade the cabin, bringing with it the smell of the swamp and something else, something subtle and disturbing. "Need a ride?" I asked, my voice sounding strangely loud in the silence, broken only by the truck's engine. She turned slowly, and that's when I saw her face. Pale, almost translucent, with large, dark eyes that seemed to see through me, to some very distant place. She said nothing, just nodded her head, an almost imperceptible movement. I opened the passenger door, and she moved towards the truck with an unsettling slowness, almost as if she were floating. There was no hurry in her movements, no relief, just a strange resignation. My eyes fixed on her dress, white, once perhaps elegant, now wet and dirty, dragging in the dust at the roadside. There were dark stains on the fabric, but the dim light from the fog and the truck prevented me from seeing clearly what they were. A chill ran down my spine, and it wasn't from the cold. It was a premonition, a silent warning screaming in my mind. You are making a mistake. But it was too late. She was just a few steps from my truck, and fate, or something more sinister, had already sealed our encounter.
The sound of the passenger door closing was almost inaudible, a dry click lost in the muffled roar of the engine. But the silence that followed, that indeed was deafening. She was sitting next to me, a pale and unsettling presence. I watched her from the corner of my eye as I returned my attention to the road, which continued to be swallowed by the dense fog. The white dress, now inside the cabin, seemed even wetter and dirtier, with the fabric strangely clinging to her thin body. Her dark hair, which before seemed only damp from the fog, now appeared heavy, some strands stuck to her pale forehead. There was no word of thanks, not even a peep, just a heavy silence that settled between us, colder than the air conditioning on full blast, denser than the fog itself outside. I tried to break the ice. "Where are you headed?" I asked, my voice sounding hoarse and strange to my own ears. She didn't reply. She just looked straight ahead, through the windshield, as if the road outside was the only thing worthy of her attention. Her gaze was empty and distant, fixed on an invisible point beyond the fog, There was no emotion, no fear, no relief on her face, just a disturbing blankness that made me feel a growing chill in the pit of my stomach. This was no ordinary person. The air inside the cabin seemed to grow colder, even with the Louisiana heat trying to seep in through every crack. A layer of icy moisture formed on the inside of the windshield, and I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end. I began to notice small details that, combined, painted an increasingly disturbing picture. She didn't seem to breathe. There was no subtle movement of the chest that accompanies a human's breathing. Her lips were slightly parted, but there was no mist of warm air that normally escapes on cold nights, not even a sound. The absence of body heat was terrifying. I instinctively reached out, as if to feel the warmth of her skin, but hesitated at the last second, pulling my hand back to the steering wheel. A part of me didn't want to confirm what the other already knew. Besides, there was a smell. At first I attributed it to the swamp, to the wet earth she carried with her, but it was something more, a sweet, funereal odor, almost like withered flowers mixed with the smell of mold and something undefinable, an aroma of decay that seemed to permeate the cabin itself. It was a smell that clung to my nose, my throat, and that grew more intense with each passing minute. I opened the window slightly to try to dissipate it, but the smell persisted, coming from her, enveloping her like an invisible cloak. Her silence became increasingly oppressive. I tried again. "Did something happen?" I asked, my voice a little stronger, hoping to elicit some reaction from her. Nothing. Just the same fixed gaze, the same blankness. The truck's engine continued its constant hum, but the sound seemed to dissipate in the heavy atmosphere of the cabin, swallowed by her presence. I began to feel a pang of panic. The solitude of the road, which had once been a comfort, now turned into a trap. I was trapped with her, and with every mile we drove, the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake grew stronger, more urgent. My eyes briefly darted to the rearview mirror, expecting to see her eyes reflected, or perhaps the movement of her shoulders. But the image was distorted by the fog outside, and I couldn't make out anything but a white blur. I gripped the steering wheel, my hands sweaty, and tried to focus on the road, but her presence was magnetic, a morbid attraction that prevented me from diverting my thoughts. With every bump the truck hit on an uneven patch of asphalt, she remained motionless, as if glued to the seat. There was no minimal movement, no slight tilt that a human body would make. And the cold, oh, the cold! It didn't come from the air conditioning. It was a cold that seemed to come from inside her, a glacial aura that penetrated me to the bone, making me shiver despite the Louisiana heat. I felt every fiber of my being screaming for me to stop the truck, to jump out and run far away from her, to escape that supernatural presence that was consuming me, but I couldn't. Something held me there, a morbid curiosity mixed with paralyzing fear. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that my life would never be the same after that silent ride. I am immensely grateful for staying with me on this chilling journey. The best is yet to come, and I guarantee this story will keep you awake for many nights. Let's move on, because the terror is just beginning.
As the journey progressed, the woman's silence became deafening. Every second seemed to drag on like an eternity, filled only by the monotonous rumble of the engine and the accelerated pounding of my own heart. I tried to ignore the growing sense of discomfort, that persistent pang of alarm screaming in some corner of my mind. I forced myself to attribute it to the accumulated fatigue of long hours on the road, or perhaps to her strange and unshakable presence. It was easier to rationalize, to try to fit it into some logical explanation, than to admit the truth that was already beginning to insinuate itself. I wasn't dealing with something normal. My mind, in a desperate attempt to find some normalcy, clung to stories, urban legends of roads, tales of apparitions and phantom hitchhikers that I heard at gas stations, always told with a tone of mockery and skepticism by older truckers. I had never truly believed in them, always seeing them as mere pastimes to ward off the boredom of late nights. But now, with her sitting just inches from me, each of those stories seemed to gain a new and terrible veracity. It was then that I began to notice the stranger details, those that my mind had tried to filter or ignore in the first moments of shock. The first was the reflection. My eyes, conditioned to constantly scan the mirrors while driving, slid to the right side mirror. I saw the side of my truck, the dense fog, but there was nothing beyond the glass. No silhouette, no blur of her white dress. I tried the left mirror. The same result, as if she didn't exist. An icy chill, much more intense than the cold I already felt, ran down my spine. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. My heart began to pound erratically, a frantic drum in my chest. I tried to force a closer look in the central rear-view mirror, the one that gave me the clearest view of the passenger seat. She remained there, perfectly still, looking straight ahead. Her eyes, they seemed to avert my gaze, or perhaps, and this was the part that terrified me most, there was no gaze to be averted. There was no life in those deep, dark eyes. They were like black holes absorbing the little light that entered the cabin. The temperature inside the cabin continued to drop. The air seemed denser, almost solidified by the cold. I could see my own breath misting slightly in front of me, a faint wisp of smoke that quickly disappeared. There was no wind, no reason for that cutting cold. It came from her proximity, from a supernatural aura that emanated from her and filled every cubic inch of space. I began to shiver, but not from cold. It was a tremor that came from within, from the most primal fear I had ever felt. It was a glacial cold that pierced my clothes and bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the air conditioning or the outside temperature. It was the cold of death, of the absence of life. My entire body screamed for me to stop the truck, for me to open the door and throw her out, no matter how cruel it seemed. But something held me back. A morbid curiosity? A paralyzing shock? I couldn't move my feet to the brake. My hands seemed glued to the steering wheel. It was as if an invisible force was preventing me from reacting, keeping me captive in my own cabin. With every curve in the road, with every headlight that passed us and disappeared into the fog, the certainty that I had made a terrible mistake deepened. I was on the edge of a precipice, and the woman next to me, this pale, silent creature, was pushing me towards it, slowly but inexorably. I didn't know what she was or what she wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. And the worst part, I knew there was no escape. At least, not at that moment. The fog, which had once seemed just a weather phenomenon, now presented itself as an accomplice, hiding our macabre secret from the outside world.
Her silence had become torture. It was an oppressive vacuum, sucking the air and sanity from inside the cabin. My nerves were frayed. Every fiber of my being screamed for her to speak, to give me a clue, a reason for her ghostly presence. I could no longer deny the inexplicable. The absence of reflection, the deadly cold, the smell of death. Everything converged to a single, terrifying conclusion. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it vibrate in my ribs, and cold sweat ran down my forehead. In a fit of desperation, I couldn't hold back any longer. "Speak to me," I yelled, my voice cracking and coming out more like a hoarse lament than a command. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The answer came. It wasn't an articulated sound in the air, not a vibration of vocal cords. It was an icy whisper, almost inaudible, that resonated directly in my mind, as if the words had been implanted there. A voice that didn't belong to this world, cold as ice, but carrying a deep, almost infinite melancholy. The words, or rather the thoughts that emerged in my mind were Belle Reve. Belle Reve, that small town a few miles down I-10, a place I knew well, unfortunately. A notorious spot for accidents where the road narrowed treacherously, flanked by ancient trees and a dark swamp. Many truckers and even families in cars had met their end there. But how did she know I knew the place? And why that name? My blood ran cold as she continued, still with that mental whisper that pierced my sanity. You left me here, just like so many others. I stared at her, shocked. No, I had never seen her before, couldn't have. But then the voice continued, and the true horror began to unfold. She began to describe intimate details of my life, things she couldn't possibly know. She spoke of the small scar on my right knee, which I had gotten as a child, falling off a bicycle. She mentioned my deceased mother's name, the soft, affectionate tone she used when referring to me. And then she touched the deepest wound, the dark secret I carried, the one that haunted me more than any ghost. You left her in the car, didn't you? That night. And then the fire came. Those words hit me like lightning. It was about Sarah, my great love, the woman I lost in a car accident years ago. I was driving and a silly argument led to a moment of anger and distraction. I refused to stop, to take her home when she asked to get out. The car caught fire, I got out, she didn't. Guilt had been eating away at me ever since, a burden I carried with every mile, every lonely day. And now a ghost in my cabin knew everything. She didn't just know, she was confronting me with it. Panic overwhelmed me in a way I'd never experienced before. It wasn't the fear of an accident, nor the dread of encountering a robber. It was existential terror. The realization that I was in the presence of something that transcended reality, something that could read my soul and extract my greatest demons. I wasn't alone with a real woman, but with an entity from another plane, a nightmare that had taken form and a seat beside me. Her eyes, previously empty, now seemed to fill with a faint, oppressive light, like two flickering candles in a dark room, and I could feel the weight of her gaze on my soul. A shiver ran through my body, not from the cold emanating from her, but from the recognition of absolute terror. I was in the presence of a ghost, and it wanted something from me.
The revelation about Sarah paralyzed me. The steering wheel seemed to melt in my sweaty hands, and my feet, once so accustomed to the pedals, now seemed glued to the cabin floor. Her voice, or rather the mental whisper echoing in my mind, had struck the most exposed nerve of my soul. I had to stop. I had to get out, breathe the dense Louisiana air, even if it meant abandoning the truck in the middle of the road. Panic, once a pang, was now an overwhelming wave threatening to engulf me. I took my foot off the accelerator, the Freightliner's engine dropping its roar to a low rumble. My fingers, trembling, reached for the parking brake. But before I could even touch it, I felt it. A cold, firm touch on my arm. It wasn't a human touch. It was as if icy claws were digging into my skin, through my shirt and penetrating to the bone. I looked up and stared at her. She had turned to me. Not abruptly, but with an unsettling slowness, like a porcelain doll whose joints moved with difficulty. Her eyes, those lifeless black holes, were now fixed on mine, and in them I could see a distorted, macabre reflection of myself, pale and terrified. Her nails, pale and translucent like those of a corpse, were dug into my forearm. exerting a supernatural force that prevented me from moving. "You won't stop." The mental whisper cut through my mind as clear as if she had screamed in my ears. It wasn't a plea. It was an order, an imposition, and I felt every fiber of my being yield to that command. The strength in her grip increased, and a phantom pain more emotional than physical radiated from where her nails dug in. I tried to pull my arm away, but it was useless. She held me with an absurd strength, preventing any movement. The truck, without my conscious control, began to swerve. The steering wheel seemed to have a life of its own, turning to the right, pulling the truck in dangerous directions, towards the side of the road, towards the dark swamps that stretched into the darkness. I fought, forced the steering wheel to the left, trying to regain control, but it was like fighting an invisible, relentless force. The truck swayed violently, the tires screeching slightly on the wet asphalt. Every attempt to control it was frustrated, and the cabin shook with the violence of the struggle. Panic turned into pure despair. And then I heard her. Not the whisper in my mind, but a real sound, faint but unmistakable. A laugh. A hissing laugh, without joy, without humor, that seemed to come from the deepest abyss. It was a sound that echoed the despair of her own soul, but that now fed on mine. A laugh that promised madness and destruction. With every sway of the truck, every time I felt the steering wheel slipping from my hands, the laugh intensified, accompanied by a guttural sound, almost a moan, that seemed to come from her throat. I saw the dense vegetation at the side of the road approach dangerously fast. The shapeless swamp trees, once just blurs in the fog, now looked like claws about to grab us. The smell of wet earth and mold mixed with her funereal odor, creating a nauseating blend that sickened me. I was about to lose control, about to follow the same path as so many other drivers before me, pulled off the road by an invisible force, or, in this case, a very visible and terrifying presence. She wouldn't let me stop. She wanted something more, and I was beginning to fear what that would be.
Her hissing laugh, the visions of accidents and shattered bodies, pushed me to the edge of the abyss of madness, but something inside me refused to completely surrender. Perhaps it was the innate stubbornness that made me a truck driver. Perhaps it was the need for self-preservation. Or perhaps it was the last remnant of sanity clinging to life. I fought. I fought against her influence, against the terror she instilled, against the invisible force that tried to rip the steering wheel from my hands and reason from my mind. I screamed. I screamed with all the strength of my lungs, though my voice seemed weak and insignificant against the chorus of ghostly voices she invoked. "Leave me alone," I yelled, feeling my throat tear. "Get out of my head." She did not back down. On the contrary, her laugh intensified, becoming sharper, crueler. The smell of death and swamp in the cabin became suffocating, almost making me vomit. She seemed to feed on my fear, my pain, my despair. I could feel her presence intensify, as if she was becoming more solid, more real as my sanity slipped away. It was a battle for my very soul, and I was losing. Amidst the chaos of voices and visions, an image flashed in my mind, clear and sharp, like a beacon in the darkness. My family. My mother's face, smiling. The laughter of my nephews during a Christmas party. The sound of my father's guitar. Sarah, before the accident, laughing as we danced in a roadside bar. These were memories of life, of love, of everything I had to lose. This memory, this connection to reality and what truly mattered, was the only thing that prevented me from completely succumbing to madness. I couldn't give in. I couldn't let her take me. Sarah was already gone, and I couldn't let this creature take what was left of me. The battle became even more visceral. My arms ached, my muscles burned with the effort to keep the truck on the road, to fight against the force pulling it. The steering wheel spun uncontrollably in my hands, and the truck slammed against the sides of the road, shaking violently, the cabin lights flickering and failing. It was an internal and external battle. The truck was out of control, and my mind was on the verge of collapse. I closed my eyes for a second, forcing myself to take a deep breath to push the voices out of my head. When I opened them, she was even closer. Her translucent face was inches from mine, her lifeless eyes staring at me with an intensity that seemed to want to steal my breath. I could see the details of her dress, now torn and ragged, the dark stains on it more visible. Blood, I realized with a shudder of horror. And the most terrifying thing, she smiled. A smile of triumph, of victory. But I wasn't going to give up. Not this way. I gathered all the strength I had left, the last drop of courage. I gritted my teeth, and with a scream that tore through the cabin, I turned the steering wheel with all my might, in a desperate attempt to get rid of her, to get back on the road, to reality. I didn't know if it would work, if it would be enough to break her spell, but it was my only chance. I wasn't going into the swamp. I wouldn't be another forgotten victim.
The visions of accidents and shattered bodies pushed me to the edge of the abyss of madness. Her hissing voice echoed in my mind, distorting my thoughts, confusing my perception. But something inside Ethan refused to completely surrender. Perhaps it was the innate stubbornness that made him a truck driver. Perhaps it was the need for self-preservation. Or perhaps it was the last remnant of sanity clinging to life. He fought. He fought against her influence, against the terror she instilled, against the invisible force that tried to rip the steering wheel from his hands and reason from his mind. Ethan screamed. He screamed with all the strength of his lungs, although his voice seemed weak and insignificant against the chorus of ghostly voices she invoked. "Leave me alone," he yelled, feeling his throat tear. "Get out of my head!" She did not back down. On the contrary, her laugh intensified, becoming sharper, crueler. The smell of death and swamp in the cabin became suffocating, almost making him vomit. She seemed to feed on Ethan's fear, his pain, his despair. He could feel her presence intensify, as if she was becoming more solid, more real as his sanity slipped away. It was a battle for his very soul, and he was losing. Amidst the chaos of voices and visions, an image flashed in Ethan's mind, clear and sharp like a beacon in the darkness. His family. His mother's face, smiling, the laughter of his nephews during a Christmas party, the sound of his father's guitar. Sarah, before the accident, laughing as they danced in a roadside bar. These were memories of life, of love, of everything he had to lose. This memory, this connection to reality and what truly mattered, was the only thing that prevented him from completely succumbing to madness. He couldn't give in. He couldn't let her take him. Sarah was already gone, and he couldn't let this creature take what was left of him. The battle became even more visceral. Ethan's arms ached, his muscles burned with the effort to keep the truck on the road, to fight against the force that pulled it. The steering wheel spun uncontrollably in his hands, and the truck slammed against the sides of the road, shaking violently, the cabin lights flickering and failing. It was an internal and external battle. The truck was out of control, and Ethan's mind was on the verge of collapse. Ethan closed his eyes for a second, forcing himself to take a deep breath to push the voices out of his head. When he opened them, she was even closer. Her translucent face was inches from his, her lifeless eyes staring at him with an intensity that seemed to want to steal his breath. He could see the details of her dress, now torn and ragged, the dark stains on it more visible. Blood, he realized with a shudder of horror. And the most terrifying thing, she smiled. A smile of triumph, of victory. But Ethan wasn't going to give up. Not like this. He gathered all the strength he had left, the last drop of courage.
He gritted his teeth, and with a scream that tore through the cabin, he turned the steering wheel with all his might in a desperate attempt to get rid of her, to get back on the road, to reality. He didn't know if it would work, if it would be enough to break her spell, but it was his only chance. He wasn't going into the swamp. He wouldn't be another forgotten victim. The truck screeched, the tires fought for grip on the wet asphalt, and I swore I could feel the metal structure twisting under my desperate command. Every yell, every shove on the steering wheel was a direct challenge to the entity haunting me. I was exhausted, my muscles burning, but the adrenaline and pure terror kept me awake, alive, fighting. I didn't know how much longer I could resist. Madness was there, lurking, ready to engulf me at any moment. Then, something began to change. It wasn't a sound, nor a feeling inside the cabin. It was a light, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the oppressive darkness outside. On the horizon, a pale patch began to emerge, tinting the sky with gray and deep purple hues. The first rays of sun. Louisiana, with its humidity and heat, was about to awaken, and with it, the light. The light seemed to have a direct effect on her. The woman beside me shivered, a quick, almost imperceptible movement, as if an electric current had struck her. The triumphant smile that had disfigured her face vanished, replaced by an expression of agony and repulsion. Her eyes, which were once dark abysses, now seemed to retract, diminishing in intensity. The cold in the cabin began to subside, gradually but perceptibly. The smell of mold and decay also began to dissipate, slowly replaced by the familiar aroma of the damp morning air in Louisiana. I felt a pang of hope, a thin thread of light in the midst of the darkness of my despair. Would the sun drive her away? As the sky grew lighter and the first rays of sun painted the truck's windshield with a pale gold, the woman began to fade. It wasn't an instant disappearance, but a slow and terrifying dissolution. Her ethereal body began to undulate even more intensely, the edges of her form becoming transparent like smoke in the wind. Her hair seemed to unravel into wisps of fog, and the white dress, once so vivid in its horror, became increasingly translucent. I watched her, fascinated and horrified at the same time, as she became more and more indistinct. Her eyes were the last to vanish, two black dots that stared at me with infinite hatred and sadness before disappearing completely. In a matter of seconds, she was gone. Nothing remained, just the empty passenger seat, the faint, persistent smell of mold and something else, something almost sweet that clung to the upholstery. The truck, for its part, stopped abruptly. The tires screeched one last time, and the engine choked, falling completely silent. A different silence than before, not oppressive, but heavy with her absence. I was in shock, my whole body trembling, sweat pouring down my face and neck. I looked outside. We were inches from a ravine, on the edge of a dark ditch filled with water and mud. If I hadn't fought, if she hadn't disappeared at the last moment, I would have been another victim of that road. I was exhausted, trembling, but alive. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. I lifted the arm she had held so tightly. There were no physical marks, no claw marks, no scratches, but the phantom pain, the sensation of cold and pressure was still there, etched into my skin and my memory. I knew with terrifying certainty that it hadn't been a nightmare, nor a hallucination. It was real, and I would never be the same. The rising sun, though it promised a new day, brought with it the certainty that the darkness I had found on the road would haunt me forever.
I survived that night in Louisiana, but I didn't emerge unscathed. The experience marked me in a way no truck crash or accident ever could have. The scars she left weren't visible on my skin, but they were deeply etched into my soul and mind. Since that chilling, haunting dawn, I've never been able to drive at night without feeling her presence. Every shadow cast by the headlights, every silhouette I caught sight of on the roadside, no matter how innocent, made me break out in a cold sweat, sent my heart racing, and forced me to relive every second of that terror. The radio, which was once a companion, was now just a source of static and noises that transformed into whispers in my mind. Gas stations, once havens of normalcy, now seemed like portals to the unknown, where I expected to see her again, lurking in the shadows. The solitude of the cabin, once a refuge, became a prison, and every mile driven was a constant reminder of the terror I had faced. The dark secret I carried about Sarah, the one the apparition had exposed so cruelly, was amplified by the terror she caused me. The guilt, which was once a heavy burden, now became unbearable, mixing with the dread of that entity. Her voice, the mental whisper, continued to echo in my mind during moments of silence, repeating the words about Sarah, about my past, about my regrets. It was a constant psychological torture, a macabre melody that gave me no respite. My mind, once resilient and accustomed to the pressures of the road, was now a tangled mess of fears and paranoia. Sleepless nights became the norm. I would wake up with a start, drenched in cold sweat, reliving vivid nightmares of the woman in white, of her hissing laugh, of those visions of destroyed cars and cries of pain. I saw her face in flashes when I closed my eyes, felt her coldness on my arm, even without touch. The smell of death and swamp pursued me like an invisible shadow. My ability to reconnect with normal life vanished. My relationships with family and friends deteriorated. I became withdrawn, avoiding conversations about the road, about what I had experienced. How could I explain the inexplicable? Who would believe it? I preferred to retreat, to carry my burden alone, to be a haunted man, condemned to relive that macabre ride repeatedly until the end of my days. The roads of Louisiana, with their mysterious swamps and treacherous fog, became for me an eternal reminder of the night when life met death and sanity met madness. My story serves as a grim warning about the hidden dangers of the road, about legends that become reality, and about ghosts that refuse to rest, dragging the living to their own damnation. It's not just a horror story, it's an account of how life can be haunted, how a single act of kindness can open the doors to personal hell, and how some wounds, the invisible ones, bleed the most. And so, the road that had always been Ethan's home became his torment. The ride that should have been an act of kindness transformed into a curse that haunts him to this day. What would you do if you found yourself in this situation? Share your opinions in the comments. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next accounts. And for those seeking more mysteries and inexplicable terrors, check out the video now appearing on your screen. I guarantee you won't regret it.